Well, we're once again going to take a look at World War II. We're going to look at battles in the Pacific, specifically the decision to drop the atomic bomb, some factors leading up to that, and then, of course, the end of the war itself. So what do we do to put an end to the war? So our goals are to describe the Manhattan Project, to evaluate reasons for and against the use of the atomic bomb, to describe the attack and ramifications of the attack on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and to describe the goals of the peace treaty that ended World War II. So first of all, the Manhattan Project. The Manhattan Project is a nickname given to the project to build the atomic bomb. And what a lot of people don't realize is it was a very compartmentalized project. While the center base was Los Alamos, New Mexico, there were all these other places where research was being done on the atomic bomb, mostly in universities, some laboratories, some private businesses, but for the most part, the atomic bomb planning was being centralized in Los Alamos, while all these universities were working on other parts of it. One of the interesting things is a lot of the people working in these universities had no idea that they were building part of the atomic bomb. They knew that they were doing some type of research related to something, but they didn't really know that it was the research on the bomb. And so this is what one of the bombs looks like. We're going to watch a video in class called Hiroshima, Why We Dropped the Bomb. It will look at some of the options of dropping the bomb, and when that's done, we can evaluate the decision to drop the atomic bomb. So after you've seen that video, one of the things we can look at is, so why did we drop the atomic bomb? And reason number one, we wanted to quickly end the war. It was estimated that somewhere between 100,000 to a million American ground troops would be taken in order to defeat Japan. Of course, some people say that a million was probably on the high side, but American lives were going to be lost if we had a conventional ground invasion. And so the idea for using the bomb is that the Japanese hopefully would quickly surrender, and we could save not only American lives, but save Japanese lives as well. Another reason for using the atomic bomb was to demonstrate the power of the American military to the Soviet Union. It's already becoming clear that eventually the Cold War is going to break out. It's becoming clear that there's an ideological battle between communism and capitalism that's going to rage in the world. And even though we're allies with the Soviets in World War II, we want to show the Soviets that we've got the power and that they need to look out for us. Another reason for the bomb, of course, is the anger towards Japanese. After the unwillingness of the Japanese to surrender at Iwo Jima, after the attacks on Pearl Harbor, after the treatment in the Bataan Death March, after the way everybody had been treated in America, many Americans at home are angry at the Japanese and they want to punish Japan. They want to get even with Japan for what they've done. And so a lot of that anger and hostility will put a lot of Americans in favor of dropping the atomic bomb. Now, there, of course, were some alternatives to the bomb. Again, the estimate was about 1 million ground troops would take to win the battle. Maybe it would have taken less, maybe it would have taken more, who knows, but still it would have been a pretty large battle to fight no matter what. Some other reasons, we did warn Japan that something bad was going to happen. At the Potsdam Conference, remember that conference before the end of World War II, where they were sort of talking about planning what to do after the Allies won the battle in Europe. By the time it was clear that we were going to win the battle in Europe, we started to send some signals to Japan. And we did warn Japan, you need to surrender now. We didn't tell them we've got an atomic bomb. We didn't tell them we had a weapon that was going to totally annihilate a city with the drop of one bomb. But we were pretty clear that we had a new powerful weapon and they needed to surrender. But once again, they refused to negotiate. They didn't give up. They didn't give in. Which brings us to this bomber, the Enola Gay. Again, if you go on the close-up trip, we might be able to go to the Air and Space Museum, the branch that's over by Dulles Airport, and there they've actually got the plane that dropped the atomic bomb on Japan. So when it comes to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the first target was Hiroshima, August 6, 1945. When the bomb was dropped, it killed 75,000 people instantly. Who knows how many thousands more would eventually die of radiation poisoning. It pretty much annihilated the city. The surprising thing, though, is even after the atomic bomb, Japan did not surrender. Even after the attack on Hiroshima, after 75,000 people were vaporized, instantly killed, Japan did not surrender. They kept fighting. In fact, the Japanese generals wanted to go on. Then on August 9th, something else happened. The Soviets decide that they are going to invade Manchuria. They're going to invade that part of China that was taken over by Japan early on in the war when Japan was building their sphere of influence. Now, why this is important is the Soviets realized with the dropping of the atomic bomb, they need to get in on this. See, they were expecting to eventually join the war, eventually help the United States defeat Japan, and if they helped the United States defeat the Japanese, then they were expecting to be able to share part of the spoils, part of the victory. Just like they divided up Germany after the war, they were thinking, hey, we're going to divide up Japan after the war. However, if we can get Japan to surrender before the Soviets enter the war, then that means we're going to get to dictate the terms of the surrender of Japan. And so the Soviets, they want to get involved so the United States cannot take all the credit for winning the battle. They want to have a say in what happens to Japan. So they invade Manchuria, they get involved, and this puts us in an even more awkward situation because we need to end this thing before the Soviets help us end the thing. That way we can dictate the terms of the surrender.
Roosevelt and Truman had been saying to Stalin, please help us with the war against Japan, please invade Manchuria, please defeat the Japanese army. But when it was realized that the Soviet Union might defeat the Japanese and then move on and occupy part of the Japanese islands, that's not what the Americans wanted at all. They wanted the task of rebuilding Japan. And I think this was one of the most important factors in influencing the American decision to drop the atomic bomb.
Of course, on that very day, August 9th, 1945, the United States decides, well, if the Soviets are going to get involved in the war, we've got to end this thing pretty quick, and so they drop a second atomic bomb on the city of Nagasaki. This time, a smaller casualty count, 40,000, but still no small number. I mean, when you consider the fact that one bomb will take out 40,000 people directly, even more people would be taken out indirectly through radiation poisoning long term. This is going to wreak havoc on the Japanese military. At this point, the Japanese emperor decides he has no choice but to surrender. Now, this is a difficult decision because many of the military commanders still don't want to give up, still don't want to give in. They still want to keep fighting, but the emperor of Japan says, no, enough is enough. We can't fight this. We can't win this battle. And so they end up surrendering. So this is what the Japanese surrender looks like.
Their challenge: turn a devastated country around, transform it into a democracy, and keep it peaceful. It was an enormous job. Japan lay in ruins. 1 million civilians dead. 2 million Japanese soldiers. 9 million homeless. 6 million stranded in the crumbling Asian empire. 1/4 of Japan's wealth destroyed. Its people exhausted and demoralized. On August 15th, they gathered around radios to listen to their emperor, whose voice they had never heard.
And the message was, things have not turned out as we expected, and he never used the word defeat, but he said essentially this is the moment where we will endure the unendurable.
So the surrender wasn't unconditional. Japan did get to keep the emperor, although he had no real power afterwards, but it really was a compromise. And a lot of the successes in the end of the war were really due to the leadership of Douglas MacArthur. MacArthur will go on to really rebuild Japan afterwards. He will become a hero. He'll also be pretty successful in the Korean War until the end of the Korean War, and then we'll find out what happens to him then. But needless to say, Douglas MacArthur is looked at as a hero in Japan.
The people had no idea what the Americans would do when they finally raised their flag over Japan. But years of propaganda told them to expect the worst. Would the American soldiers rape and pillage, as the Japanese had done across Asia? How harshly would they punish their enemies? But the Americans had anticipated this moment. For as long as they fought the war, they had been planning for victory, planning the occupation. Key to that plan was a strong leader. General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers.
He had a notion that he would be like the emperor. He would be detached, but he would also be fair and generous.
And so then finally, when we look at the peace treaty, instead of punishing Japan like we wanted to punish, well, not we, but the British and the French wanted to punish Germany after World War One, we realized that that was a mistake, and so instead we try to help rebuild Japan. Instead of tearing them down like we did to Germany after World War One, we helped to rebuild Japan, and we really helped to revitalize their economy, which we basically say we're going to be the military for Japan for the next forever. Including to this day, most of the Japanese military forces are really American troops defending them. The other thing that we want to do is we want to build the democracy in Japan. So even though we say that the emperor gets to keep his symbolic role, America starts to build the democracy in Japan, and that democracy looks fairly similar to the American style of democracy. When MacArthur was writing the Japanese Constitution, he wrote something that was pretty similar to what the American Constitution looked like.
MacArthur understood the symbols of power and the power of symbols. He brought an armada of ships into Tokyo Bay and orchestrated an elaborate ceremony on the battleship Missouri. His message to the Japanese was clear. Surrender is unconditional. America is in charge.
Let us pray that peace be now restored to the world, and that God will preserve it always. These proceedings are closed.
Swarms of United States aircraft fly in formation overhead as the ceremony ends. The final United Nations victory has been won. The war is over. Peace is here.
In Japanese eyes, it was a legitimate occupation. They had agreed to it. They had surrendered unconditionally, and many Japanese said, it's not that we welcome being occupied, but it can't be helped. It is an opportunity to create a new society.
MacArthur's first step was to establish authority. He saw that the emperor could be vital. The emperor may have been a war criminal, he may have been the head of a martial regime, but to the Japanese, he was still a divine symbol. So instead of putting him on trial, MacArthur's plan called for using him to bolster American legitimacy.
No longer a god on a white horse, he moves among his people as a man and tells them, the ties between us do not depend on mere legend and myth. In this new role, the emperor becomes a symbol of national unity.
Eventually we get to VJ Day, Victory in Japan Day, which is September 2nd, 1945. You don't need to memorize the day, but on that day, the war in Japan officially comes to an end, really bringing World War II to an end. So after the surrender of Germany earlier and eventually the surrender of Japan, World War II comes to an end, and then we can start planning for the Cold War. This is one of the most famous pictures from the end of the war, a Navy sailor kissing a nurse from World War II in a parade in New York City. So what a way to end. Hope you enjoyed this lesson and have a great day.